The Texas sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Clara Hayes heard the sound that would change everything. She froze mid-step on the creaking porch of her cabin, a bucket of well water balanced on her thin hip. The sound came again. A low groan carried on the evening breeze through the towering pine trees that surrounded her small homestead. It was the kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, the kind that spoke of pain and desperation. Clara was 12 years old, but the wilderness had aged her beyond her years. Her parents had died 2 winters ago, her father from fever and her mother from the heartbreak that followed. The neighbors who had promised to look after her had moved on to San Antonio, leaving her with the cabin, a few chickens, and the kind of solitude that either breaks a person or makes them strong. Clara had chosen strength, though some days it felt more like stubbornness. She set the bucket down carefully and reached for the old rifle propped against the doorframe. Her father had taught her to shoot before he taught her to read, and she thanked him for that every day. The piney woods of East Texas were beautiful but unforgiving, and a girl alone needed to be ready for anything. Bears, wild hogs, drifters, men with bad intentions. The woods held all kinds of dangers. The groan came again, closer this time, from the direction of the creek that ran through her property. Clara descended the porch steps, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. The last light of day filtered through the pine needles, casting long shadows that danced and shifted. She moved carefully. The rifle raised, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What she found by the creek made her breath catch in her throat. A man lay slumped against the trunk of a massive pine, his wrists bound tight with rope and his ankles tied together. His clothes were torn and dusty, the remnants of what might have once been a Confederate cavalry uniform. Blood had dried on his temple, and his face was bruised and swollen. But it was his eyes that struck her most. When they opened and met hers, they held no threat, only exhaustion, and something that looked like resignation. "Please," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Water," Clara hesitated. Every instinct her parents had taught her screamed caution. Strange men meant danger. Bound men meant trouble had already found them. But as she looked at him, she saw something else too. She saw the way his breathing was shallow and labored, the way he couldn't even lift his head properly, the way his lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. She saw someone who was going to die if nobody helped him. She lowered the rifle slightly and took a step closer. "Who are you? Why are you tied up?" The man tried to speak but only managed to cough. His eyes moved to the creek just 10 feet away, then back to her face. The plea in them was unmistakable. Clara made a decision that her cautious mind told her was foolish, but her heart knew was right. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and knelt beside the creek, cupping her hands to gather water. She carried it carefully to him and held it to his lips. He drank desperately, water spilling down his chin, and when he finished, he closed his eyes and took a shuddering breath. "Thank you," he whispered. "Name's Thomas. Thomas Brennan. I was a scout. For the Rangers. The Texas Rangers?" Clara's eyes widened. The Rangers were legendary, the men who brought order to the chaos of the frontier. He nodded weakly. "Was tracking a gang, land grabbers. They've been terrorizing homesteaders, forcing them to sell their property for nothing. They caught me 3 days ago. Beat me, tied me up, left me here to die. Wanted to send a message." Clara felt a chill run through her. She had heard stories of such gangs, men who exploited the lawlessness of the post-war years to steal land and build empires of greed. "Where are they now?" "They've got a camp about 5 miles north, but they'll come back. They always come back, to make sure their messages are received." His eyes opened again, focusing on her with sudden intensity. "You need to leave here, girl. Get as far away as you can. When they find me still alive, they'll burn everything within 10 miles. But Clara shook her head. She looked at the ropes binding his wrists, then at the darkening woods around them. An idea was forming in her mind, dangerous and probably foolish, but the only one that made any sense. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. "And neither are you. Not like this." She pulled the hunting knife from her belt and began sawing at the ropes around his wrists. Thomas tried to protest, but he was too weak. The rope was thick and rough, and it took several minutes of determined work before his hands came free. He groaned as blood rushed back into his fingers, his hands shaking as he tried to flex them. "There's a ranger outpost," he managed to say, as she moved to his ankles. "Fort Richardson. 30 miles west. If you can get me there, They'll come. They'll stop this gang before more families suffer. 30 miles. Clara had never traveled more than 5 miles from her cabin in her entire life. The woods at night were treacherous, full of ravines and creeks and animals that hunted in the darkness, and Thomas could barely stand, let alone walk. It seemed impossible, but as she cut through the last of the rope and helped him try to sit up straighter, Clara thought of her parents. She thought of the neighbors who had left, of the families she had heard about who had lost everything to men like the ones who had done this. She thought of what her father would have done, what her mother would have wanted her to do. "Can you walk?" she asked. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw a skinny girl with tangled brown hair and eyes that held more determination than fear. He saw someone who had already survived more than most people twice her age. And he saw someone who wasn't going to take no for an answer. "With help," he said finally. "Maybe." Clara stood and offered him her hand. "Then we start now. We have all night to reach the fort, and I know these woods better than anyone. But we have to move fast. If that gang comes back at dawn—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Thomas gripped her hand and let her help pull him to his feet. He swayed dangerously, and for a moment she thought he would collapse, but he steadied himself against the tree and took a shaky breath. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara. Clara Hayes." "Well, Clara Hayes," he said, managing the ghost of a smile despite his pain. "Lead the way." And so, as the last light faded from the Texas sky and the stars began to emerge through the canopy of pines, a 12-year-old orphan girl and a wounded warrior began a journey through the darkness. Neither of them knew that by dawn everything would change. Neither of them could have imagined what waited at the end of the path Clara was about to forge through the wilderness. But they took the first step together, and in that moment, a bond was forged that would echo far beyond the piney woods of East Texas. The first hour was the hardest. Thomas leaned heavily on Clara's shoulder, each step a battle against pain and exhaustion. She had wrapped his arm around her neck and held his weight as best she could, though he was nearly twice her size and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. But Clara had learned long ago that pain was just another challenge to overcome, and she gritted her teeth and kept moving. The forest at night was a different world. The familiar paths she walked by day became shadowy mazes, where every sound seemed amplified, and every shadow could hide danger. Owls hooted in the distance, and something rustled in the underbrush to their left, making Thomas tense and reach instinctively for a weapon he no longer had. Clara had grabbed her rifle before they left, slinging it across her back along with a small satchel containing dried meat, a canteen of water, found the few medical supplies her mother had left behind. "We need to stay along the creek as long as we can," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of running water. "It'll lead us west and the sound will cover our footsteps. If that gang has scouts out, we don't want them hearing us." Thomas nodded, too breathless to speak. Every step sent jolts of pain through his ribs, which Clara suspected were bruised if not broken. His head wound had stopped bleeding, but she knew he needed proper medical attention soon. 30 miles had seemed daunting in daylight. In the darkness, with an injured man to support, it felt almost impossible. But Clara had not survived 2 years alone by giving up when things seemed impossible. They followed the creek for nearly 2 miles, the water providing a natural guide through the darkness. The moon was only a sliver, offering little light, but Clara's eyes had adjusted to the gloom. She knew every bend in this waterway, every place where the banks grew steep, every fallen log that crossed the current. This was her territory, the landscape of her daily survival, and she moved through it with the confidence of someone who had no choice but to know it intimately. "We need to rest," Thomas finally gasped, his legs beginning to give out. Just for a moment, Clara guided him to a fallen log and helped him sit. His breathing was ragged, and in the faint moonlight she could see sweat glistening on his forehead, despite the cool night air. She uncorked the canteen and handed it to him, watching as he drank carefully, rationing the water even in his desperation. "Tell me about the gang," Clara said quietly, keeping her voice low. "How many are there?" Thomas wiped his mouth and leaned back against the log, his eyes closed. "About 15 regular members, led by a man named Garrett Shaw, former Confederate officer who learned all the wrong lessons from the war. He's smart, ruthless, and he's got connections with corrupt land office officials in Austin. They identify valuable properties, then terrorize the owners until they sell for pennies or just abandon their claims. Shah's built an empire on other people's misery. Why doesn't the law stop him? Some try. That's why I was tracking him. But he's careful. Never leaves witnesses. Never makes moves that can be traced directly back to him. He has men who do his dirty work, while he maintains a respectable front in town. The Rangers have been trying to catch him for 2 years, but evidence is hard to come by when everyone who could testify is too scared or too dead. Clara felt anger rising in her chest. She thought of her own little homestead, the land her parents had worked so hard to claim and build on. The idea that men like Shaw could just take it, could terrorize families and destroy lives for profit, made her hands clench into fists. "The fort," she said. "If we get you there, will they really come? Will they stop him?" Thomas opened his eyes and looked at her. Even in his weakened state, she could see the determination there, the fire that had made him a ranger in the first place. "If we get there, I'll make sure they come with an army. Shaw crossed a line when he left me to die. The Rangers take care of their own, and they'll bring every man they can spare to end this. But, Clara, we have to get there. If we don't, if I die out here in these woods, Shaw wins. More families suffer. More good people lose everything. Then we keep moving," Clara said simply. She stood and offered her hand again. 5 minutes of rest is all we can afford. We still have more than 20 miles to go, and dawn comes fast. They pressed on. The creek eventually curved north, and Clara made the decision to leave its protection and strike out west through deeper forest. It was a risk, but staying on the obvious path was a risk too. She chose a route that took them through the densest parts of the pine woods, where the canopy was so thick that even in daylight it remained perpetually shadowed. Here they would be harder to track, harder to spot if anyone came looking. Thomas's condition worsened as the night wore on. His steps became more unsteady, and several times Clara had to catch him before he fell. She was exhausted too, her shoulders burning from supporting his weight, her legs trembling with fatigue. But she kept moving, kept talking to him in low whispers to keep him conscious, kept putting one foot in front of the other because stopping meant giving up, and giving up was not something Clara Hayes knew how to do. "Tell me about your family," Thomas murmured at one point, his words slightly slurred. Clara worried he might be slipping into delirium from his injuries. "My father was a farmer," she said, as much to keep him awake as to answer. "Came to Texas after the war looking for a fresh start. My mother was from Louisiana. Followed him west because she believed in his dreams. They built the cabin themselves, cleared the land, planted crops. It was hard work, but they were happy. Then the fever came through and—" She trailed off, the memories still sharp even after 2 years. "I'm sorry," Thomas said softly. "No child should have to survive alone." "I'm not alone right now," Clara replied, and she felt him squeeze her shoulder gently in response. As they walked, Clara told him about her life in the woods, about learning to hunt and fish, about tending her small garden, about the chickens she kept and the way she bartered eggs with the occasional passing traveler for supplies she couldn't make herself. She told him about the books her mother had taught her to read, and how she would sit on the porch in the evenings and read them aloud to the empty air, pretending her parents were still there to listen. She told him about the loneliness, yes, but also about the peace she had found in the wilderness, the way she had learned to hear its rhythms and understand its moods. And as she talked, Thomas listened, and somehow the darkness seemed a little less oppressive and the journey a little less impossible. They were perhaps 15 miles from the fort when disaster struck. Clara's foot caught on a hidden root in the darkness, and she stumbled forward. Thomas, unable to catch himself, fell heavily to the ground with a cry of pain. Clara scrambled to her knees beside him, her heart pounding. "Are you hurt? Thomas, talk to me." He groaned and tried to push himself up, but his arms gave out. "My ribs," he gasped. Something's wrong." Clara's hands shook as she carefully felt along his side. Even through his shirt, she could feel the unnatural angle of at least one rib, maybe more. The fall had made his injuries worse, possibly much worse. She looked around desperately, trying to orient herself in the darkness. They were still so far from help, and Thomas was fading fast. "Listen to me," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Leave me. You know these woods. You can make it to the fort by dawn if you go alone. Tell them. Tell them Thomas Brennan sent you. Tell them about Shaw. They'll come." "No," Clara said firmly. "I didn't bring you this far just to leave you now. Clara, be reasonable. I'm slowing you down. I might not make it anyway, but you can. You have to. I said no. Clara's voice was fierce now, louder than she had allowed herself to be all night. We walk out of these woods together, or we don't walk out at all. That's final. Thomas looked at her, this stubborn, brave girl who refused to abandon him even when any reasonable person would have. He saw something in her that reminded him of why he had become a ranger in the first place, why he had dedicated his life to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He saw the future of Texas in her determined eyes. All right, he said quietly. Together then. Clara helped him to his feet one more time, taking even more of his weight now. Her legs trembled, her back ached, and every step was agony. But she kept moving. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the first hints of dawn touching the horizon. They had maybe 2 hours of darkness left, and still more than 10 miles to go, but Clara had made a promise and she intended to keep it. As they stumbled forward through the pine forest, she began to sing softly, an old hymn her mother used to sing. It helped her keep rhythm, helped her focus on something other than the pain and exhaustion. And beside her, Thomas Brennan, wounded warrior of the Texas Rangers, found strength he didn't know he still possessed. Together, they walked toward the dawn, two souls bound by necessity and determination, racing against time through the heart of the wild Texas night. Neither knew what awaited them at journey's end, but both knew one thing with absolute certainty: they would face it together. Dawn was breaking over the pine forest when Clara and Thomas finally emerged from the densest part of the woods. The sky had transformed from black to deep purple to a pale orange that promised the full arrival of day within the hour. Clara's entire body was numb with exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep moving. Thomas was barely conscious now, his full weight draped across her shoulders, his feet dragging more than walking. Every 100 yards felt like a mile, every small rise in the terrain like a mountain. But there in the distance, Clara could see it. The fort. Fort Richardson sat on a rise of cleared land, its wooden walls and watchtowers dark shapes against the brightening sky. Smoke rose from chimneys inside, and even from this distance, Clara could see movement as the garrison began its morning routines. It was still at least 3 miles away, maybe more, but it was there. Hope, tangible and real, rose in Clara's chest. "Thomas," she said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and the night's silence. "Thomas, wake up. We're almost there. I can see the fort." Thomas stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. He looked toward where she was pointing, and she felt his body tense with something that might have been relief or might have been the last reserves of his strength being called upon. "You did it," he whispered. "Clara, you actually did it." "We're not there yet," she replied, but she allowed herself the smallest smile. "Can you walk a little? We need to move faster now. The sun's coming up, and if that gang was planning to come back to check on you..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Both of them understood the danger. If Shaw's men discovered Thomas was gone, they would search, and if they found tracks leading west toward the fort, they would know exactly what had happened. It would become a race, and Clara wasn't sure they could win it. They pressed forward with renewed urgency. The terrain here was more open, rolling grassland dotted with clusters of oak trees. It offered less cover but easier walking, and Clara was grateful for that. Thomas was trying harder now, lifting his feet, attempting to bear some of his own weight. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a difference. As they walked, the sun crept higher, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful, the kind of sunrise that Clara's mother used to call a gift from God. But Clara barely noticed it. Her entire focus was on the fort, on covering the remaining distance before their strength gave out completely, or before something stopped them. They were perhaps a mile away when Thomas suddenly gripped her arm. "Stop," he said urgently. "Listen." Clara froze. At first she heard nothing but the morning birds and the whisper of wind through grass. Then, carried on that wind, she heard it. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving fast, coming from the direction they had just traveled. Her blood ran cold. "They found your trail," Thomas said grimly. "Shaw's men, they're coming." Clara's mind raced. They were still too far from the fort to reach it before the riders caught up to them. The open grassland offered nowhere to hide. If the gang reached them, everything they had endured through the night would be for nothing. Thomas would die, and probably Clara too. Shaw would continue his reign of terror, and more families would suffer. "No," Clara said fiercely. "We're too close. I won't let them stop us now." She looked around desperately and spotted a small cluster of oak trees about 200 yards to their left. Not much cover, but better than nothing. More importantly, there was a rocky outcropping there, the kind of terrain that might slow horses but could be navigated on foot. "There," she said, already moving toward it. "We make for those rocks. If we can get to higher ground, maybe we can signal the fort, get their attention before the gang reaches us." Thomas didn't argue. They stumbled toward the rocks as fast as Thomas's failing strength would allow. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew louder. Clara risked a glance back and felt her heart sink. She could see them now, at least a dozen riders emerging from the tree line, and they had spotted their quarry. Shouts carried across the grassland, and the riders spurred their horses faster. Clara and Thomas reached the rocks with perhaps 2 minutes to spare. Clara helped Thomas into a defensive position behind a large boulder, then unslung her rifle. She checked the ammunition, her hands surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. She had 5 shots, 15 men. The math was not in their favor. "Clara," Thomas said, his voice urgent, "you can still run. Head for the fort. They want me, not you. You might make it." "We've had this conversation," Clara replied, not taking her eyes off the approaching riders. "I didn't like your suggestion then, and I don't like it now." Despite everything, Thomas almost smiled. This girl, this incredible, stubborn, brave girl, was going to fight beside him. He wished he had a weapon, wished he had the strength to protect her, but all he could do was watch as she raised the rifle to her shoulder and took aim. The riders were 300 yards away now, 250, 200. Clara could see their faces now, hard men with harder eyes, the kind of men who had learned to take what they wanted and never look back. Leading them was a tall man on a black horse, and even from this distance Clara could sense the authority he carried. Garrett Shaw. It had to be. Clara didn't want to shoot. She had hunted for food, had shot animals for survival, but she had never aimed a weapon at another human being. Her hands began to tremble, and doubt crept into her mind. Could she actually do this? Could she take a life, even to save Thomas, even to save herself? The riders were 150 yards away. 100. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger, and then from behind them a sound that made Clara's heart leap. A bugle call, clear and bright in the morning air. She spun around and saw what Thomas had already seen, what had put that look of fierce joy on his battered face. The gates of Fort Richardson had opened, and riders were pouring out. Not just a few, dozens. The entire garrison, it seemed, was mounting up and thundering toward them. Someone at the fort had seen them, some sharp-eyed sentry doing his morning watch had spotted 2 figures being chased across the grassland and had raised the alarm. Now the full might of the United States Army was bearing down on Shaw's gang, and the hunters had suddenly become the hunted. Shaw saw it too. Clara watched as he reined in his horse, his men pulling up in confusion around him. For a moment, everything hung in balance. Then Shaw made his decision. He wheeled his horse around and shouted orders. His gang turned and fled back toward the tree line, but they were too slow. The army riders, fresher and better mounted, were closing the distance rapidly. Clara lowered her rifle, her legs suddenly weak with relief. She turned to Thomas and saw tears streaming down his face, though whether from pain or joy or simple exhaustion, she couldn't tell. Probably all 3. "We made it," she whispered. "Thomas, we actually made it." "You made it," he corrected gently. "I just tried not to slow you down too much." The army riders split into 2 groups. One group, at least 20 strong, pursued Shaw's fleeing gang. The other group rode directly toward the rocks where Clara and Thomas waited. Leading them was an officer Clara later learned was Captain James Morrison, a man with steel-grey hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. He saw Thomas's ranger badge, still pinned to his torn shirt. He saw the wounds, the rope's burns on his wrists, the exhaustion written on his face. And he saw Clara, a skinny girl in a worn dress holding a rifle almost as big as she was, standing protectively beside the wounded ranger. "Ranger Brennan," Morrison said, and his voice was thick with respect. "We've been searching for you for 3 days. When you didn't report back from your scouting mission, we feared the worst." "The worst nearly happened," Thomas replied weakly. "Would have, if not for this girl. Captain Morrison, meet Clara Hayes. She saved my life." Morrison turned his full attention to Clara, and she felt herself shrink a little under that intense gaze. But then the captain's weathered face broke into a smile, and he extended his hand to her. "Miss Hayes, the United States Army is in your debt. What you did tonight, that took courage of the highest order." Clara shook his hand, too tired to feel embarrassed, too relieved to feel proud. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said softly. "No," Thomas said firmly. "You did what heroes do, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows it." A medical corpsman had dismounted and was already examining Thomas, his practiced hands assessing injuries with efficient gentleness. Other soldiers formed a protective perimeter, watching for any sign that Shaw's gang might regroup and attempt another attack. But Clara knew they wouldn't. Shaw was running now, and the army was on his trail. The reign of terror was over. As the soldiers prepared a stretcher for Thomas, he reached out and caught Clara's hand. "Come with us to the fort," he said. "Don't go back to that cabin alone. Not yet. Not until we're sure Shaw has been dealt with." Clara wanted to protest, wanted to insist she would be fine, but the truth was she was exhausted beyond measure. The thought of the long walk back to her cabin, of being alone again after the intensity of this night, suddenly seemed unbearable. "All right," she agreed. "Just for a day or two." Captain Morrison had other ideas. As they rode toward the fort, Clara sitting in front of one of the soldiers, while Thomas was carefully carried on the stretcher, Morrison rode alongside them. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I'd like to discuss your future with you if you're willing. A girl with your skills and courage shouldn't be living alone in the wilderness. There are opportunities, ways we might be able to help you build a better life." Clara looked at him surprised. She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to understand what opportunities a 12-year-old orphan could possibly have. But before she could speak, they crested the rise, and Fort Richardson spread out before them in the golden morning light. What Clara saw there made her gasp. The entire garrison had turned out, soldiers lining the parade ground, all standing at attention. As the gates opened to admit them, a cheer went up, loud and genuine, a tribute to the wounded ranger and the girl who had brought him home. And there, standing at the center of it all, was a group of men Clara didn't recognize. They wore civilian clothes, but they carried themselves with military bearing. Rangers, she realized. Thomas's brothers in arms, men who had been preparing to ride out in search of their missing comrade. But it was what happened next that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. As Thomas was carried past them on his stretcher, each ranger touched his shoulder or gripped his hand, their faces showing relief and pride. And then, one by one, they turned to Clara. They removed their hats, these hard men of the frontier, and they bowed to her. A 12-year-old girl who had done what they had feared might be impossible. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Relief, exhaustion, the release of fear she had been holding in all night. It all came out at once. Thomas reached out from his stretcher and squeezed her hand one more time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." As the fort's doctor led Thomas away for treatment, and Captain Morrison guided Clara toward the officers' quarters where she could rest, she turned to look back at the eastern horizon. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the Texas landscape in warm light. Out there somewhere in the pine woods was her cabin, her home, her old life. She wondered if she would ever see it the same way again. She also wondered about Captain Morrison's words, opportunities, a better life. What could that possibly mean for someone like her? Clara didn't know it yet, but she was about to find out. The night's journey had ended, but a new chapter was just beginning. And when dawn came tomorrow, 300 riders would be waiting at her gate, ready to show her just how much one act of courage could change the world. Clara slept for 14 hours straight. When she finally woke, disoriented and confused, she found herself in a real bed with clean sheets and a soft pillow, luxuries she had almost forgotten existed. The room was small but comfortable, with whitewashed walls and a window that looked out over the fort's parade ground. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass, and for a moment, Clara wondered if the entire night had been a fevered dream. Then she sat up and felt every muscle in her body protest. Her shoulders ached from supporting Thomas's weight, her legs were stiff and sore, and her feet were blistered and raw. No, it had been real. Every exhausting, terrifying, triumphant moment of it had been absolutely real. There was a gentle knock at the door, and a woman entered carrying a tray of food. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and the capable air of someone used to taking charge. "Ah, you're awake," she said warmly, setting the tray on a small table beside the bed. "I'm Margaret Morrison, the captain's wife. You gave us quite a scare sleeping so long. The doctor checked on you twice to make sure you were all right." Clara's stomach growled loudly at the sight and smell of the food. Fresh bread, stew, apple pie, milk. "Thank you, ma'am," she said softly, suddenly aware of how she must look with her tangled hair and dirty dress. Margaret smiled. "Eat first, then we'll get you cleaned up and into some proper clothes. After that, there are some people who would very much like to speak with you if you're feeling up to it." "Thomas," Clara said immediately. "Is he—" "Ranger Brennan is recovering well. 3 broken ribs, a concussion and more bruises than anyone could count. But the doctor says he'll make a full recovery thanks to your quick action. He's been asking about you constantly, wanting to make sure you're all right." Relief flooded through Clara, and she felt tears prick her eyes again. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and took Clara's hand gently. "You saved his life, dear. A few more hours in those woods and he wouldn't have survived. The whole fort is talking about your courage." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded and turned her attention to the food. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger, barely able to believe how good real cooking tasted after 2 years of her own simple meals. Margaret watched her with satisfaction, occasionally refilling her glass of milk. When Clara had finished, Margaret helped her draw a bath in a copper tub and provided her with clean clothes, a simple but well-made dress that had belonged to Margaret's daughter before she married and moved to Austin. Clara scrubbed away 3 days of dirt and pine sap, then allowed Margaret to help her untangle and brush her hair. When she looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the clean, neat girl staring back at her. "Much better," Margaret said with approval. "Now, are you ready to meet some visitors? I promise they'll be gentle, but there's a lot of interest in your story." Clara nodded, feeling nervous but curious. Margaret led her out of the room and through the fort's administrative building. Soldiers they passed stopped and nodded respectfully to Clara, which felt strange and uncomfortable. She was just a girl who had helped someone in need. She didn't understand why everyone was making such a fuss. Margaret brought her to Captain Morrison's office, where a surprising number of people had gathered. Captain Morrison stood behind his desk, his expression serious but warm. Thomas Brennan sat in a chair by the window, his ribs wrapped in bandages and his face still bruised, but his eyes bright and alert. Around the room stood 7 other men, all wearing the distinctive badges of Texas Rangers. And in the corner taking notes was a man Clara didn't recognize, wearing spectacles and holding a writing journal. "Miss Hayes," Captain Morrison said, standing as she entered. "Thank you for joining us. Please sit down." He gestured to a comfortable chair that had been placed in the center of the room. Clara sat, feeling very small among all these important men. Thomas gave her an encouraging smile, and that helped settle her nerves a little. "First," Morrison began, "I want to personally thank you again for what you did. Ranger Brennan has told us everything. How you found him, freed him, and led him through 30 miles of wilderness at night to bring him to safety. That's extraordinary by any measure, but particularly for someone your age." One of the rangers, a tall man with a graying beard, stepped forward. "Miss Hayes, my name is Captain William Cordell, and I'm the commanding officer of the Ranger Company stationed here at Fort Richardson. What you did for Thomas, for all of us really, goes beyond simple gratitude. In the Rangers we have a code. When someone saves the life of one of our own, especially at great personal risk, we consider that a debt of honor, and the Rangers always pay their debts." Clara shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I don't want payment, sir. I just did what was right. And that's exactly why we want to help you," another ranger said, a younger man with intense dark eyes. "Thomas told us about your situation, living alone in that cabin, surviving by yourself for 2 years. That's admirable, Miss Hayes, but it's no life for a child." "I'm not a child," Clara said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I take care of myself just fine." Thomas spoke up from his chair. Clara, they're not trying to insult you. We all know how capable you are. You proved that last night better than anyone could have imagined, but capable doesn't mean you should have to do it alone. There are other options now. Captain Morrison leaned forward on his desk. We've been discussing your situation all morning, Miss Hayes, and we'd like to present you with some possibilities. First, my wife and I would be honored to have you stay with us here at the fort. Margaret has been talking about it since you arrived, and we have the space and the means to provide you with a proper home, schooling, and a chance at a normal childhood. Clara's throat tightened. A home, a family. Things she had tried not to dream about for 2 years, because dreaming only made the loneliness worse. But she thought of her cabin, of her parents' graves on the hill behind it, of the land they had worked so hard to claim. Could she really just leave it all behind? There's another option, Captain Cordell added. The Rangers maintain a network of supporters and friends throughout Texas, good families who understand the work we do and want to help. We could place you with one of these families, people who would raise you as their own and give you every opportunity to build a good life. And there's a third possibility, said the man with the journal, speaking for the first time. His voice was refined, educated. My name is Daniel Archer, and I write for the Austin newspaper. When word of your deed spreads, and it will spread, Miss Hayes, you'll become something of a celebrity. There will be families lining up to offer you homes, opportunities you can't even imagine right now. The story of the orphan girl who saved the Texas Ranger will capture hearts across the state. Clara felt overwhelmed. Too many choices, too many possibilities, all coming at her at once. She looked at Thomas, silently pleading for help, making sense of it all. Thomas struggled to his feet, waving off the ranger who tried to help him, and moved to kneel in front of Clara's chair, so they were at eye level. Clara, listen to me. You don't have to decide anything right now. Take your time. Think about what you want. What would make you happy? Whatever you choose, we'll all support you. That's a promise. But what about Shaw? Clara asked suddenly. The gang. Are they caught? Captain Morrison's expression grew serious. The patrol caught 3 of Shaw's men yesterday. They're in the stockade now. The others scattered, including Shaw himself, but we have rangers tracking them as we speak. Within a week, I expect we'll have rounded up most of them. They'll face justice for their crimes. And my cabin, Clara's voice was small. Is it safe? We've posted guards on your property, Cordell assured her. Nothing will happen to it or your belongings. If you decide you want to go back, we'll make sure it's secure first. And if you decide you want to leave it behind, we'll help you sell it fairly and ensure the money goes toward your future. Clara sat in silence, trying to process everything. These men, these powerful, important men, were offering her choices. Real choices about her future, about her life. 2 days ago, her biggest decision had been whether to check her rabbit snares before or after tending the chickens. Now she was being asked to choose the entire direction of her life. Can I think about it? She asked finally. Just for a little while? Of course, Margaret Morrison said warmly from the doorway where she had been listening. You take all the time you need, dear. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay with us for as long as you like. The meeting broke up after that, with each ranger making a point to shake Clara's hand and express their personal gratitude before leaving. Thomas lingered, moving slowly back to his chair with obvious pain. Are you really all right? Clara asked him once they were alone, except for Margaret, who was tidying up the office. I will be, thanks to you. The doctor says I'll be back on duty in about 6 weeks. He studied her face carefully. Are you all right? I know this is a lot to take in. Clara nodded slowly. It's just strange. Yesterday morning I was worried about my vegetable garden, and now people are talking about newspaper stories and families wanting to adopt me. It doesn't feel real. It's real, Thomas said gently, and you deserve every good thing that's coming your way. You've earned it 100 times over. I just helped someone who needed help. No, you risked everything to save a stranger. You showed the kind of courage most grown men don't possess. That matters, Clara. That changes things. Margaret came over and put a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. Why don't we take a walk around the fort? Let you stretch your legs and get some fresh air. All this talk and decision-making can wait until tomorrow. Clara agreed gratefully, and Margaret led her outside into the afternoon sunshine. The fort was busy with activity. Soldiers drilling, horses being exercised, wagons bringing in supplies. Everyone they passed seemed to know who Clara was, and many stopped to nod respectfully or offer words of thanks. It was overwhelming and embarrassing, and Clara had to admit, a little bit wonderful. They walked along the fort's walls, and Margaret pointed out various buildings and explained how the fort operated. But eventually she grew quiet and simply walked beside Clara, seeming to understand that the girl needed time to think more than she needed information. "Mrs. Morrison," Clara said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, dear. And please call me Margaret. When you and the captain said I could stay with you, did you mean it? Really mean it? Not just saying it because you feel obligated?" Margaret stopped walking and turned to face Clara fully. "My dear girl, James and I have wanted a daughter for 20 years. We have 2 sons, both grown now and serving in the army themselves, but we never had a daughter. When you arrived yesterday, so brave and exhausted and still so determined to make sure Thomas was taken care of before you'd rest yourself, well, I saw the daughter I always hoped for. So yes, I meant it. We both did. We would be honored and delighted if you chose to make your home with us." Tears filled Clara's eyes. "But you don't even know me. What if I'm not what you expect? What if I disappoint you?" Margaret pulled Clara into a gentle hug. "Sweetheart, you saved the life of a Texas Ranger against impossible odds. You survived alone in the wilderness for 2 years. You have more strength and character than most adults I know. There is no way you could possibly disappoint us." Clara buried her face in Margaret's shoulder and let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from relief and hope, and the overwhelming feeling of being wanted, of mattering to someone again. She had been so alone for so long, had been so strong because she had no other choice. The possibility of letting someone else be strong for her, of having a family again, was almost too much to bear. They stood there for a long time, this woman who wanted a daughter, and this girl who wanted a mother, holding each other in the afternoon sun while the fort bustled around them. Neither spoke because no words were needed. Finally, Clara pulled back and wiped her eyes. "I'd like to see my cabin one more time before I decide anything. Is that all right?" "Of course it is. We'll arrange an escort for you, probably a dozen rangers who will fight over the honor of accompanying you." Margaret smiled. "But not today. Today you rest and recover. Tomorrow is soon enough to think about the future." That evening, Clara had dinner with the Morrisons in their private quarters. It was strange, sitting at a real table with a real family, eating a proper meal, while Captain Morrison told stories about his years in the army, and Margaret asked Clara gentle questions about her life before her parents died. But it was also wonderful, and Clara found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of her comfortable room, Clara thought about choices and futures, and the strange way life could change in a single night. She thought about her parents and what they would want for her. She thought about her cabin in the woods, and whether home was a place or the people you shared it with. And she thought about Thomas Brennan, lying in the hospital wing, recovering from wounds that would have killed him if she hadn't happened to hear that groan in the darkness. She thought about how one small decision, to investigate a sound instead of ignoring it, had led to all of this. Tomorrow she would visit her cabin one last time. She would stand on that porch where she had heard Thomas's voice, would look at the woods she knew so well, and she would make her choice. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Clara Hayes fell asleep feeling safe, wanted, and full of hope for whatever came next. Outside her window, the stars shone bright over Texas, and somewhere in those stars, Clara liked to think her parents were smiling. The morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for riding. Clara stood in the fort's stable yard, watching as rangers prepared horses for the journey to her cabin. True to Margaret's prediction, there had indeed been competition among the rangers for the honor of escorting Clara home. In the end, Captain Cordell had simply assigned 6 men, along with himself and, against the doctor's strong objections, Thomas Brennan. "I can ride," Thomas insisted, moving gingerly toward his horse. "And I need to see this through. Clara brought me out of those woods. I'm going to be there when she goes back." The doctor threw up his hands in exasperation, but knew better than to argue with a stubborn ranger. "Fine, but if you tear those stitches or collapse from your horse, don't come crying to me." Clara had been given a gentle mare named Daisy, and one of the rangers helped her mount. She had ridden before, though not often, and she felt a flutter of nervousness as she settled into the saddle. But Daisy seemed to sense her uncertainty and stood perfectly still, patient and calm. Margaret Morrison came out carrying a packed satchel. "Food for the journey," she explained, handing it up to one of the rangers. "And Clara, dear, remember, whatever you decide, we support you completely. There's no wrong choice here." Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Then Captain Cordell gave the signal, and they rode out through the fort's gates. The morning sun was behind them, casting long shadows across the grassland as they headed east toward the pine woods. The ride was pleasant, almost peaceful. The rangers talked among themselves about routine matters, carefully avoiding putting any pressure on Clara. Thomas rode beside her, moving carefully, but managing to stay in the saddle despite his injuries. Every so often he would glance at her and smile, and Clara would smile back, grateful for his quiet presence. As they entered the pine forest, Clara felt a strange mixture of emotions. These woods had been her home, her refuge, her prison, and her kingdom all at once. She knew every tree, every creek, every hidden dell. The rangers were following the main trail, but Clara could have led them through a dozen different routes, all the shortcuts and secret paths she had discovered in 2 years of solitary exploration. "Tell me about your parents," Thomas said quietly as they rode. "What were they like?" Clara was surprised by the question, but found herself wanting to answer. "My father was tall and strong, with hands that could fix anything. He used to laugh a lot, especially when things went wrong. He said there was no point getting angry at problems when laughter made them easier to bear. My mother was quieter, but when she smiled it lit up the whole room. She loved books and music, and she made our little cabin feel like a palace just by being in it. They sound wonderful." They were. They taught me everything important: how to work hard, how to be kind, how to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. When they died, I thought I'd lost everything. But now I realize they left me something more valuable than the land or the cabin. They left me the person they raised me to be. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "That's a precious gift. And judging by how you turned out, they were excellent teachers." It took 3 hours to reach the cabin, following the trails at an easy pace. When they finally emerged into the clearing where Clara's homestead sat, she pulled Daisy to a stop and just stared. It looked exactly the same. The small log cabin with its stone chimney, the vegetable garden slightly overgrown but still intact, the chicken coop where her 3 remaining hens scratched in the dirt. The porch where she had heard Thomas's groan, the well where she had drawn water 1,000 times, the hill behind the cabin where her parents were buried under simple wooden crosses. Everything was the same, and yet everything felt different. The rangers dismounted and spread out, checking the perimeter and making sure no threats lurked nearby. Captain Cordell had taken the threat of Shaw's remaining gang members seriously, and he wasn't going to let Clara be exposed to any danger. But the clearing was peaceful, undisturbed except by the normal sounds of forest life. Clara dismounted and walked slowly toward the cabin. Thomas followed at a respectful distance, understanding that she needed to do this herself. She climbed the 3 steps to the porch, each board creaking in familiar patterns. The door was unlocked. She had never bothered with locks when there was nothing worth stealing and no one to steal it. Inside, everything was as she had left it. The simple table and 2 chairs her father had built, the narrow bed in the corner, the stone fireplace where her mother had cooked, the small shelf of books, her most precious possessions, each one read dozens of times. The life she had built alone, the survival she had carved out of loneliness and determination. Clara walked through the single room, touching familiar objects. Her mother's cast-iron skillet, her father's whittling knife, the quilt her grandmother had made, worn thin but still serviceable. Each item held memories, some painful and some beautiful, all precious. She went back outside and walked to the hill behind the cabin. The 2 graves were simple, marked only by wooden crosses her father had ironically made himself years ago for a different purpose. Clara had carved their names into the wood with painstaking care. John Hayes, loving husband and father, and Sarah Hayes, beloved wife and mother. She knelt between the graves and spoke softly. "Mama, Papa, I hope you've been watching. I hope you saw what happened, how I helped that ranger. I hope you're proud of me." Her voice caught. "I have a choice to make now. I can stay here, keep living the way I have been, taking care of the land you worked so hard for. Or I can go with the Morrisons, have a real family again, get an education, maybe have a future you always wanted for me." The wind rustled through the pines, and a bird called somewhere in the distance. Clara waited, half hoping for a sign, for her parents' voices to tell her what to do, but there was only silence and the whisper of wind. "I think," she said slowly, working through her thoughts as she spoke, "that you'd want me to choose life over memory. You'd want me to have every chance to be happy, to grow up safe and loved, to become everything I can be. You'd tell me that this land and this cabin are just things, but family and love and opportunity are precious." Tears streamed down her face. "So I think I'm going to go with them. The Morrisons are good people, and they want me, really want me, not out of obligation but out of love. And I can still come back here, still visit you, still remember, but I don't have to survive anymore. I can actually live." She stood and placed a hand on each cross. "Thank you for everything you gave me. Thank you for teaching me to be strong enough to survive alone, and brave enough to accept help when it's offered. I love you both so much, and I always will." Clara walked back down the hill to find Thomas waiting at a respectful distance. "I'd like to gather some things," she told him. "Things that belong to my parents, my books, some clothes. Would that be all right?" "Take whatever you want," Thomas assured her. "We'll help you pack it all and bring it to the fort." For the next hour, Clara moved through the cabin, selecting items that mattered most. The rangers helped her pack them carefully into saddlebags. The books, her mother's favorite shawl, her father's pocket watch, the quilt, a few kitchen items that held memories. She didn't take everything, just the pieces that carried the most meaning. As they worked, Captain Cordell approached her. "Miss Hayes, we've been discussing your property. If you're planning to live at the fort, you'll need to decide what to do with this land. You could sell it, or you could keep it and hire someone to maintain it. Either way, we'll make sure you get fair value and that the money is secured for your future." Clara looked around the clearing one last time. "I'd like to keep it," she said finally. "Maybe someday I'll want to come back, or maybe I'll pass it on to my own children someday. But it was my parents' dream, and I don't want to let go of it completely." "That's a fine decision," Cordell said approvingly. "We'll arrange for a local family to look after it, tend the garden, keep the cabin in good repair. Consider it done." When everything was packed and ready, Clara took one final walk around the property. She visited the chicken coop and scattered extra feed for the hens who would be taken to a neighboring farm. She checked the vegetable garden and mentally noted which plants would need attention soon. She stood on the porch and looked out at the woods that had been her entire world for 2 years. "Goodbye," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping me safe." Then she turned to Thomas and the rangers and nodded. "I'm ready." They rode away from the cabin as the sun began its descent toward afternoon. Clara looked back only once, seeing the small structure growing smaller in the distance, surrounded by the vast green ocean of pine trees. She felt sadness, yes, but also relief and excitement and hope. She was leaving behind survival and stepping toward life. The ride back to Fort Richardson seemed shorter, perhaps because Clara was moving toward something instead of away from it. The rangers were more talkative now, telling stories and joking among themselves, including Clara in their camaraderie, in a way that made her feel accepted and valued. As they emerged from the woods and the fort came into view, Clara saw something that made her pull Daisy to a stop. The gates were open, and people were gathered outside them. A lot of people. More people than Clara had ever seen in one place. "What is that?" she asked, confused and a little frightened. Thomas looked and his eyes widened. "Oh my," he said softly. "Clara, I think word has spread faster than we expected." Captain Cordell rode up beside them, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "Miss Hayes, it appears your story has made quite an impression. These are people who've come from all over the region to see you, to thank you, to offer their support." As they rode closer, Clara could see the crowd more clearly. There were ranchers and farmers, townspeople and soldiers' families, children and elderly folks all gathered and waiting. And in the front, arranged in perfect formation, were hundreds of horses with riders in various uniforms and clothing. Rangers, army cavalry, civilian volunteers. Thomas leaned over and spoke quietly. "In the ranger tradition, when a great deed is done, those who respect it gather to pay tribute. I think, Clara, that you're about to receive the greatest honor the Texas frontier can bestow." Clara's heart pounded as they rode toward the assembled crowd. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't know what was expected of her, But she held her head high and kept Daisy moving forward. As they reached the crowd, Captain William Cordell rode ahead and raised his hand. The murmur of voices fell silent. He turned his horse to face Clara, and his voice rang out clear and strong. Today we honor Clara Hayes, who saved the life of Texas Ranger Thomas Brennan through courage, compassion, and extraordinary determination. By the codes of honor that govern the Rangers, and all who respect justice and bravery, we declare a debt that must be acknowledged and repaid. He dismounted and walked to stand before Clara's horse. Then, to her complete astonishment, he removed his hat and bowed deeply. Behind him, every single ranger did the same. Then the cavalry soldiers. Then the civilians. 300 riders all bowing to a 12-year-old girl. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as the crowd erupted in cheers. She looked at Thomas, who was smiling despite the obvious pain the emotion cost his injured ribs. She looked at the faces in the crowd, seeing respect and admiration and genuine affection from people who didn't even know her, and she realized that while she had left behind her cabin in the woods, she was arriving at something infinitely more valuable. She was arriving at community, at belonging, at a place where she would never have to be alone again. Margaret Morrison pushed through the crowd and helped Clara dismount, then pulled her into a fierce hug. "Welcome home, dear girl," she whispered. "Welcome home." As the sun set over Fort Richardson that evening, Clara sat on the porch of the Morrison house, watching the sky turn gold and orange and purple. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about her future. But tonight, she was simply a girl who had been brave when it mattered, who had saved a life when she could have walked away, and who had earned the respect and love of an entire community. She had left the woods behind, but she had found something better. She had found home.